Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Kwangyin Liu. I'm with CommonWealth magazine, 天下杂志. So we're celebrating our 45th anniversary this year. And so I guess you could say that we are resilient, in the words of Mr. Barroso. So thank you guys for staying for the second energy panel discussion of today. I think the energy security is such an important issue that it's really on everyone's mind. And so to open today's panel discussion, I would like to say that what's the biggest challenge for Taiwan, Japan, Korea? It's powering the most powerful semiconductor and AI facilities while also trying to hit net zero targets and facing difficult pressures. So I'm also happy to bring people's attention to the 4-year research initiative that CAPRI has embarked on. They are going to partner with researchers across Asia Pacific, including those in Australia, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, among others. There's a long list. Sorry, I cannot memorize it. But today, I'm really honored to be joined by such distinguished panelists, and I would like to start today's discussion with something that's really on everyone's mind. So, as an energy reporter for over 10 years, I am always struggling to try to find the best way to cover energy because people know that in Taiwan, especially, the topic of energy is highly polarizing because sometimes it's not entirely scientific. Most of the time it's political, but most importantly, it's very economical. And so the first very challenging question I would like to pose to our panelists, and first I would like to start with Ali to give us a more global view. And the first question is, how are governments and industries prioritizing the tensions between equitable growth, energy security, and decarbonization? Where do you see the most difficult trade-offs emerging today? So please, Ali.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate the kind opportunity. So jumping directly to addressing your question, let me first begin by highlighting the positive points we are already in the world. Over the last 20 years, we've seen investment in deployment of energy transition grow from just about $60 billion back in 2005 to over $2.3 trillion last year. And the result of that is all the technologies that we need for decarbonizing the energy economy. For about 75% of global emissions, we already have them. And more importantly, they're already affordable if we have the right regulatory framework. And then when it comes to the third component of the energy trilemma that you pointed out around energy security, as in the first panel, Professor Thornburn very eloquently already highlighted, because these technologies lower the dependence on the need to import fossil fuels, they actually strengthen energy security. Yes, there are some areas that are very challenging, and I'm sure we're going to hear, for example, from Henry around challenges in specific sectors. But by and large, from a technological perspective, we've already made significant progress. To give you some examples, not from developed economies, but more importantly from emerging economies. For example, in 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, LNG prices globally went through the roof. That meant Pakistan couldn't afford to buy more LNG. What happened? The result of that was a lot of the corporate companies in Pakistan started deploying solar because it was affordable and they could get power. More recently, we've seen Ethiopia ban the sales of internal combustion engine vehicles to be able to accelerate EV adoption to lower dependence on spending of its relatively limited foreign currency reserves on buying petroleum products to import. So the energy trilemma is being balanced, but the trade-off is, do we have the political willingness to undertake reforms needed to accelerate the deployment of these technologies? And on that front, I'll conclude with highlighting the EU third energy package that was actually passed during Professor Barroso's term as the European Commission presidency. The challenge is we need to undertake reforms that allows the energy system to transition, and this can be politically difficult because there are certainly negative impacts on incumbents.
Thank you, Ali, for giving us the global perspective. And next, I would like to turn to Mika to give us the Japanese perspective on the most difficult trade-offs of energy transition.
Okay, thank you, Kwangyin, for the introduction. And then I'm really pleasure to be here as a panel. I think the discussion about the green transition in Japan and Asia Pacific has already changed years ago. It is no longer only about climate, but it is about energy security, industrial competitiveness, and economic resilience in that area. In that sense, investment in renewables, energy efficiency, batteries, and power grid is a strategy to strengthen energy independence and resilience. The most difficult challenge is balancing short-term price stability with long-term structural transition. This is especially difficult for energy-intensive industries such as steel, chemicals, and semiconductors, which must reduce emissions while remaining globally competitive. That is why we first need to maximize energy efficiency, electrification, renewable electricity procurement, and process optimization. And then technologies like hydrogen and CCS should be focused only on sectors where there are very limited alternatives. I also think it is important to recognize that the main bottleneck today is not technology itself. The cost of solar wind batteries are falling very rapidly. The real challenge is institutional. As Ari said, that the trade-off is the political will to go for the transition. The transition is being slowed by limited grid capacity, delays in grid connections, slow permitting processes, lack of long-term investment certainty, and outdated electricity market design. Over the past few years, more than 90% of new power capacity added globally has been variable renewable energy, mainly solar and wind. Asia is following that trend. The technology that are expanding fastest today and will continue to expand over the next decade. The key question is how we can integrate these technologies into the market and power system at scale. And for that, institutional reform is essential.
Thank you, Mika. And next, I would like to turn to Mr. Kim for the perspective from South Korea.
Well, thank you. It's really honor and pleasure to join as a panel for this forum. And let me start with the policy objective you mentioned, like equitable growth, energy security, and also decarbonization. All three sit at the core of any serious economic agenda today, and none can be easily sacrificed. So I would like to slightly reframe the question. The real challenge is not simply which to prioritize, but how much weight, how much speed we assign to each. So because in practice, these objectives pull against one another in very concrete ways. So carbon pricing accelerates decarbonization, but raises costs. Localizing supply chains builds resilience, but reduces efficiency. The fossil fuel investment secures near-term supply, but creates potential stranded asset risk. So for Korea, these tensions are not abstract at all. We import roughly more than 90% of our primary energy. while running an economy built on electricity-intensive exports, including semiconductors, steel, and also petrochemicals, etc. And we have committed to ambitious emissions target in line with global norms. So the trilemma is not a policy choice for us. It is the structural condition within which every decision has to be made. And what makes this trade-off so difficult is that they are not at root technical problems, in my view. They are problems of value. For instance, what is the true social cost of energy poverty? What is the true social and environmental cost of delayed decarbonization? And how do we price the long-term risk of stranded fossil fuel assets? Without answers to the questions like this, investment decisions remain simply guesswork, and policy ends up reacting to crisis rather than shaping the energy transition issue. This is where some of the most useful work is happening at the boundary of the public and private sectors. And SK Group, one of the Korean conglomerate with its business portfolio that spans semiconductors, energy, bio, telecommunication, and AI, we have been developing a framework called DBL, double bottom line. And DBL is the systematic measurement of both financial returns and social value as well, integrated directly into investment decision making. In practice, this means assigning explicit value to emissions reduced, to environmental externalities, and to broader social outcomes. For example, by assigning a quantified value to each ton of carbon reduced and incorporating it directly into capital allocation. Just for more details, this brochure is placed over the table, and also the soft copy will be sent to you by email, and that includes our DBL framework, formulas, and several case studies, including our collaborative work with SASAC in China too. So to come back to the question, these trade-offs cannot be eliminated, but they can be managed far better than they currently are if value is properly measured, properly priced, and properly reflected in financial decision. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. And last but not least, very happy to see an industrialist among the speakers. I will have Henry tackle the question.
First of all, also thank you very much for having me here. I think as the only one who's in the heavy industry. From Taiwan, if you think about the energy policy in the last 10 years, I want to recite a slogan that came up 10 years ago, first in Chinese, and I'll translate. Very simple, was what we were going to do is 非核、减煤、增气、展绿. Okay, maybe some of you remember all this. What this means is we're going to reduce using coal, we're going to increase gas, we're going to phase out nuclear completely, and then we're going to ramp up renewable energy, namely wind and solar. Now, under this big umbrella, the hydrocarbon basically still remains, of course, the largest portion, 80% of Taiwan's energy, or more. And at that time, it seems like we were going to use renewable energy to replace nuclear. Hence, I think Kwangyin mentioned that this issue become very political and polarized in Taiwan. Kind of set off a camp of people who were very pro-nuclear against a camp who was very pro-renewable energy. Because, of course, people who are against nuclear fuels, there's still a lot of safety issues. We don't have a solutions to nuclear waste. People against renewables, this is still very intermittent, but also the cost is very high. But 10 years later, I think like Ali said, with a lot of the positive investments, the cost of, I would not say all, but some of the renewable energy is actually now very cost competitive. I remember 20 years ago when we looked at, investing in possibly in a solar project. Basically, we were looking for a subsidy price from the government at about starting at 10 NT per kilowatt hour. But now, there are a lot of people basically would invest in themselves because it's already cost competitive. So if you look at the issue we lay out here, the energy security and green transition, I would say nuclear and renewable energy actually should be in the same camp. They both help in energy security and in green transition. So we should try to develop this as much as possible and try to reduce the hydrocarbon. Therefore, I don't think there's much sort of tension in this trade-off from this very high level. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Henry. So I also support the all of the above approach. But then I have this one particular question for Henry, because you're an industrialist, and Donghe Steel is one of Taiwan's most important and largest steel maker. So a particularly challenging question would be, how do you balance the goal of decarbonization while maintaining national security, because steel industry is very crucial for resilience and national security?
Well, Kwangyin, thank you for asking this. I think in the green transition, while we're mostly talking about source of energy and electricity, to achieve the decarbonization and green transition, actually all the heavy industries should carry its load, namely steel, aluminum, oil refining, fertilizer, cement. These are the industries actually, as you all know, the European Union are at the most forward in asking these industries to buy carbon credits and also set up CBAM systems to protect these industries in this transition process. So these industries, if they could be more efficient in its energy use, it actually is already helping a lot in its green transition process. Much more than when we ask you to turn off your lights, maybe turn up the temperature in your air conditioner. These industries can actually do a lot. But since this is a think tank, and I think we should think big and think out of the box. But in the picture of green transition, how could we rearrange these industries, from the mining all the way to its consumer, in a way that helps this process? This is very different from today. If you think about national security, obviously every country would like to have its own industry in the most complete way. What I mean is that if I have the iron ore myself or any kind of oil well, and then I can have the smelting or the refinery, and then I have the downstream applications, and then I can help the whole economy grow. That is the most ideal situation for national security. And I think China actually has done the best in developing all this. You all know that they have the most rare earth capability, not only in the mines, but have even greater smelting capability. So they take ore from outside and process them in their country. Okay? So in this sense, for the large industries, the national security versus green transition is, I think, in a conflict. So it's very hard for us to now. I think that in an earlier panel, and I did talk to Liz earlier. Maybe we should make all the steel in Australia, and then just ship them to East Asia for further processing. That's actually probably the most green way, because we'd be transporting probably 1 billion tons of material less. Because for transporting iron ore, for example, to make 1 ton of steel in Taiwan, you need to transport 1.6 tons of iron ore from Australia, plus another 0.7 tons of coking coal. That's 2.3 tons. But if we make it there in Australia, immediately we're shipping a lot less. And this is actually the biggest seaborne trade for bulk carrier in the world. And just by doing that, is already a lot of decarbonization. However, this is a very big challenge, because will we give up our steel industry? We would not be able to make very special steel when we want to develop certain parts in a drone, or we want to make some special parts in a new nuclear plant. So I think this is something that us as a think tank to really further explore in this coming study.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. I think this warrants a separate panel discussion on the dilemma between decarbonization and national security, because carbon emissions don't vote. So what's best for the world's decarbonization is not necessarily the best solution for individual countries. So that's really a very difficult question to answer. But the next question will be for Mr. Kim. So we keep hearing that the costs of renewable energy, especially solar, are becoming lower and lower, and it's becoming more affordable. So then, from an investor's perspective, I would like you to maybe talk to us about why there are still a lot of difficulties, and what are the risks that still make green energy project difficult to scale, and how does a policy or regulatory condition make these investments financially sustainable? What's the solution?
I don't know if I can provide a solution for that, but thank you very much for the question. From an investor's perspective, the constraint of green energy investment today is not a shortage of capital. I think it is a shortage of better or more bankable opportunities. Means opportunities with returns predictable enough to deploy capital at scale. So the question is fundamentally how policy and market design shape risk. And let me focus on two conditions. The first one is policy stability. So investors need confidence that the rules under which a project was financed will still hold 5, 10, 15 years ahead. And let me also share one of the experience that I had. Korean battery companies, including LG and SK, committed a significant capital in the United States based on a clear long-term policy signal. But when that signal shifted, particularly with Trump administration uncertainty around IRA, Inflation Reaction Act incentives, those investment assumptions began to break down. And when policy predictability weakens, even well-founded investment stall. Not because the underlying economics changed, but because the risk-adjusted return did. And second one is pricing future value. The many critical investments in the energy transition do not generate immediate, fully monetizable returns. Their value lies in future and in the emissions they will reduce, in the technologies they will enable, and in the risks they will help avoid. But today, that future value is largely invisible to markets, and when value is not priced, it won't be financed. So to the question becomes, how do we bring forward the value of future carbon abatement into today's investment decisions? One potential answer lies in forward-looking mechanism where expected emissions reductions from emerging technologies can be quantified, valued, and transacted in advance. This is a bit different from ETS, the current system. And this allows capital to flow today against the future impact, enabling companies to be valued not only on the current cash flows, but on their expected contribution to decarbonization. In other words, we move from ex-post compensation to pricing those outcomes in advance. This is the logic behind so-called outcome-based funding, means financing outcomes that are measured, verified, and priced in advance. And so let me also introduce another initiative, which was initiated by Chairman Chey at SK Group, and that is a new framework called EPC. I feel like I'm a kind of bookseller or the leaflet seller, but
So call this number if you're interested.
This brochure, this leaflet is also placed on the table, and EPC means Environmental Progress Credit, and it seeks to assign a tradable, verified value to future carbon abatement. It seeks to verify emissions reductions, quantify them, price them in advance, and turn them into a tradable asset. In other words, it makes future social value visible to capital markets today. And ultimately, without mechanism like this, without the ability to measure, price, and bring forward future value, capital will not flow at the scale this transition requires, regardless of how far the technology advances. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. So it looks like new financial and pricing models are really necessary to accelerate the transition that we all wanted. And so next question would be for Mika. And I think this is also a topic that has been brought up many times today, which is nuclear power. Could be a sensitive topic, but what's interesting is I myself was just in Tokyo in March and was very surprised to see that 15 years after the Fukushima Daiichi incident, Japan is now seems to be restarting many of its nuclear reactors. So after such a very visible crisis, how is the Japanese society balancing fear and maybe need for energy security, and what's really happening in Japan?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. But I just want to confirm the numbers, because before the Fukushima Daiichi accident, that we had the 54 reactors in Japan. But now the government successfully, open the restarting the nuclear is, I think, the 14 reactors, with all efforts of restarting. So it's not the many reactors. So it is true that public attitudes and the current administration policy toward nuclear are changing in Japan, but it is important to understand what is behind this shift. This is not necessarily a rapid expansion of support for nuclear power. It is more a growing passive acceptance of nuclear as a practical option and the concerns about energy security and rising electricity prices. Japanese government has shifted from a policy of reducing dependence on nuclear energy toward maximum use of nuclear power. That discussion now includes extending reactor operations and new construction of reactors. But there is still a large gap between the policy message and the reality of the energy system and the market reactions. First, nuclear power faces a serious time challenge. Even restarting existing reactors has been slow, and building new reactors would take more than 20 years. So it is extremely difficult for nuclear to play a major role in emission reductions or stable electricity supply by 2030. That's the challenges. The government understands this situation so that 20% of nuclear by 2040 is the maximum idea that included in the energy plan. What matters for energy security and climate security agency is not only whether the technology is theoretically zero emission, but how quickly it can actually be deployed within the next decade. Second, there is the issue of cost. Across Asia, the cost of solar, wind, and batteries are falling rapidly. At the same time, nuclear power faces growing uncertainty because of higher safety costs, construction delays, and rising financing costs. Third, there is the issue of industrial competitiveness. Many Japanese companies, especially RE100 companies and export-oriented industries, increasingly need large amounts of renewable electricity procurement. Sectors such as semiconductors, data centers, automobiles, and chemicals are under growing pressure to procure low-carbon electricity. At the same time, Japan's biggest bottleneck is not technology, but institutions, limited grid capacity, weak investment, weak regional connections, grid access restrictions, renewable curtailment, long environmental assessment, and complex permitting processes are slowing renewable deployment. Japan is not constrained by lack of technology. It is constrained by the slow pace of institutional reform. So I do not think the issue should be framed as a simple choice between nuclear and renewables. More important question is how to redesign the power system, and the key challenge is how to build a more distributed and flexible energy system. Some countries are discussing nuclear power or LNG in the name of energy security, but in reality, a renewable-based system that reduces dependence on imported fuels becomes the realistic energy security strategy, lowering costs and increasing self-sufficiency. This is already happening in European countries. Portugal, for example, together with Spain, is becoming a strong leading case of how the green transition can improve energy independence by reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels. The rapid expansion of variable renewables and hydropower has helped reduce exposure to fossil fuel price shocks, while also highlighting the importance of investment in grids and storage. And I think that is really the core issue of the green transition in Japan and in Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Mika. So I know that our other panelists probably, if you also want to respond to the issue of nuclear energy, so does anyone would like to maybe add a few words? And so as you probably already know that the restarting of nuclear reactors is also a hot topic here in Taiwan, because the decision seems to have been made that the reactor 2 and 3 are going to be restarted, and if they do, it will maybe make up to 6 to 8% of Taiwan's baseload power supply. Does anyone want? Okay, so Henry, please.
I jump into this, and it looks like I'm pro-nuclear now, but I just want to say, given the experience of very polarized in the last, 10 years, I think it's to encourage people who are involved, whether from government to private sector to academia, to be very open-minded about all these developments. The safety around nuclear has improved a lot. There's new technologies in, like molten salt, nuclear reactors. There's SMR. All these things are still in the distance, but it's something that we will be able to benefit in the future with much lower reduced risk. And so to be very, very open-minded and learn as much as possible through this process, as opposed to, no nuclear in Taiwan, so we're not going to learn anything about this. I think that's very important for Taiwan going forward. As we are, like Kwangyin said, we're reopening, number 2 and number 3 reactors. In the process, I'm sure we're going to make it much more safe.
Thank you, Henry, for your contribution. And my next question would be for Ali. So you're from BloombergNEF, and I would like you to maybe talk about the rapid green transition that's happening in China. So I think everyone is also very paying close attention to China's advancement in green technologies, because it's really reshaping regional, maybe global energy markets as well with the green supply chain. So how should Asian economies respond to both the opportunities and maybe risks posed by China's green supply chain?
Thank you very much. Let me first start by just explaining the current state of China's advancement in energy transition. So since 2013, China has been the single largest market globally in investing in deployment of energy transition technologies. I mentioned at the beginning that last year, globally, the investment was about $2.3 trillion US. China was $800 billion, by far way ahead of any other market. As a share of GDP, China's investment was about 4.5%. The next most advanced is the EU as a whole, which is only about 2.2% as a share of GDP. Here in Taiwan, that number was only 1.2% as a share of GDP. So China has done significant advancement in deployment, and as Henry also mentioned, in the entire value chain for production of the equipment as well. Now, as Professor Thornburn also mentioned in the first panel, the reasons behind this are not exclusively because of climate change. The first primary reason that China has embarked on this journey is really from energy security perspective. If we go back to the turn of this century, at that point, China was somewhat still self-sufficient in its energy needs, and its reliance on fossil fuel imports were fairly limited. But as its economy grew, it became actually the largest buyer of oil, and actually increasingly now even LNG. And to mitigate this energy security risk, the government decided that it should prioritize deployment of indigenous resources. That includes renewables, nuclear, but also coal, as well as on the demand side, electrify more and more share of the economy to reduce the need for imports of fossil fuels. The second thing was around industrial competitiveness. China recognized that these are the industries of the future. It did not take an ideological view, as we've seen, unfortunately, in some political parties in Western democracies. Rather, it said, we want to be able to have the ability to export more technologies globally. These seems to be growing industries, so why not invest in these growing areas? And the final one was more about the local pollution, less about CO2, but more about political stability associated with satisfaction of people in terms of when it comes to air and water and soil pollution. The Communist Party is very, very attuned to any sort of discourses around disgruntled people. And if you look at statistics around protests in China, over the last 2 decades, most of the protests are actually tied into these sort of local nuances around air, soil, and water pollution. A lot less to do with political structure. Now, to get to the crux of the question that you're asking, So China has become now the world's largest manufacturer of these technologies, and it's increasingly posing a challenge to other countries that would like to have these industries as well. And here, I would like to echo Professor Barroso's 3 Ps around looking at, for each economy, they should really think carefully about, okay, what are their current industrial advantages? Are there areas that they still can promote and remain competitive? And of course, for those, pursue those. Are there areas that they can look at, for example, partnering with China? Yes, a lot of economies are concerned about the significant advancements that China has had, but these can also be an advantage. So I'll give you 2 concrete examples. Solar modules, okay? This is an industry where globally the manufacturing capacity is more than 4 times what the current demand is. In fact, we have enough manufacturing capacity that we could accelerate deployment to be aligned with a Paris Agreement trajectory. So for any economy, as we've seen unfortunately in the case of Japan or Taiwan, to say that, no, we want to prioritize producing modules domestically, which by the way is a passive component, it doesn't have any communication element, from an economic competitive perspective is very, very challenging. On the other hand, when it comes to inverters or PCS, so for example, this is an area where Taiwan has leading manufacturers. Delta Electronics is one of those. So these are where you could be much more strategic and you could say, okay, we're going to prioritize that localization. So there's a bit of a balance in terms of taking advantage of the improvements in cost and scale that China has made, while at the same time protecting domestic industry. The difficulty here is that what we've seen is many governments have a very knee-jerk reaction where they put in local content requirements where the scale of their domestic economy can't really support. There are some good examples of local content requirements. Again, with the wind sector, for example, Brazil is one of the biggest successes globally, but it worked because it had a large enough of a market. If you look at the offshore wind industry here in Taiwan, the local content requirements that the government put in actually, maybe saying the word kill is too extreme, but it pretty much did. And maybe linking this back to your nuclear question, one of the difficulties here in Taiwan is, as Henry mentioned those slogans earlier, Taiwan met its nuclear phase-out goal, but it didn't meet its renewables goals. And part of the reason it didn't meet the renewables goals was actually going back to these sort of decisions around industrial competitiveness. The last thing I'll say is, for policymakers, it's really critical to distinguish between capital goods and consumables. When it comes to energy security, one of the big problems is that a lot of policymakers either intentionally or unintentionally conflate these 2 things. Having an import dependence on solar modules from China is very different than having an import dependence on LNG and oil from the Hormuz Strait. Even if you're Japan that can manufacture its own gas turbines, that gas turbine is going to need LNG imports for its entire lifetime. But if you import solar modules from China, once you've installed that, you have your domestic energy security. This is something that when it comes to this debate, a lot of time politicians like to conflate it. Those 2 things are not the same.
Thank you, Ali. So very, very great points we should all consider. So we are short on time, but I would like to ask each of the panelists to tell us what's the most fundamental institutional change you would like to see over the next 5 to 10 years for the green transition to take root. So Mika, may I start with you?
I think the most critical institutional change that have to be happen in over next 5 to 10 years is the redesign energy system around cheap energy source, which is renewables at the core, not as a supplementary power source. The technology is already exist. We need much larger investment in grids, storage, flexibility, and demand-side management, together with predictable long-term policies that can mobilize private capital. To achieve this, regional collaboration will be essential in Asia-Pacific. For example, Taiwan has become a leader in offshore wind development, and there is strong potential to build more cooperative regional supply chain, including with South Korea, in areas which has vessel operations and related infrastructure. The question is, if future generation has to invest again in those technology and institutions after a decade, why we don't do it now?
Thank you, Mika. Strong message. So, Mr. Kim?
Let me close with one thought. Over the past roughly 2 decades, energy transition, renewable energy has been driven largely by technological plus operational progress. The falling cost in solar, wind, and batteries we can see. In fact, solar and wind equipment manufacturing has become largely commoditized, as Kwangyin and also Henry mentioned. And if I look back, yes, the Q-Cell, that was the #1 player in Europe and globe 20 years ago, merged with Korean company Hanwha, but you cannot find the name at the top 10 list. And 10 years ago, Suntech, Inli, Chinese #1, 2 player, disappeared. And all the top 10 players are mostly Chinese. They don't make money because it's commoditized. And this trend will continue. The next phase will be defined less by technology and more by our ability to measure value, to price it, and to make it investable at scale. So the real question is whether our financial system, our pricing mechanism, our risk-sharing structure, and our investment frameworks are capable of deploying it at the speed and scale required. And to conclude, I don't know, when you enter the airport yesterday or before, I don't know how many people, the foreigner, used the APEC Business Travel Card, which was introduced back in 1996 and introduced by Australia, Philippines, and Korea, 3 countries, and now expanded to, 20 countries. So I introduced a bit conceptual and provocative idea about TBL and also EPC today. And I hope that we can find a more collaboration opportunity together to do a more in-depth analysis and introduce this system for our future together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. So, Henry, what's the change you would like to see?
I don't know about change, but one of the major concerns I have in terms of Taiwan's green transition right now is we have a very ambitious goal on offshore wind, I think like Mika has mentioned. But the fact is, I don't think these projects on an overall scale is actually going very well. For example, each round of bidding, there was originally maybe 5 or 6 winners to develop these offshore wind farms. But as far as I know, in each of the 3.1, 3.2 round right now, there's only 2 developers left. And I think it largely has to do with the financing problem that you all mentioned, around renewable energy. The costs, yes, over the last 20 years is coming down, but it's not a straight line. I think with a lot of people fighting to complete these things in 2030, maybe Taiwan, Korea, Japan, all fighting for that same boat to install the wind turbine tower. So you jack up the price. We together jack up the price, and so then it's not cost effective anymore. So these things, at the same time, along with things that Ali mentioned, we all want local content. We want, as low as possible, the FIT takeoff price. These things all contribute to a lot of problems in these developments. So I would say we want to see that these projects can really smoothly deliver renewable energy for Taiwan, in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Henry. So I don't know about you, but I really enjoy these discussions. I feel like I'm really happy to have energy nerds with us. But I think Mika wants to have last
Just
word.
a kind of 30 seconds responding to what he said. Because we are on the same board, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, so we need a regional collaboration. Successful case in Europe is not only single country or single investment or single developer can create the cheaper offshore wind case. That is the good competition all over Europe. They take the role each other. So the Japan can collaborate with other countries, that cooperation, supply chains, and then reduce the cost of renewables.
Thank you, Mika. And I think, Ali, you have 30 seconds.
All right. So very quick for Taiwan. If Taiwan wants to meet its emission reduction and balanced energy trilemma, there's two things that are really critical. Electricity market reform. Unless Taipower's current structure is not changed, you're not going to meet your goals. Apologies for being blunt, but that's the way it is. Second one, land use reform. Land use policy needs to be grounded in science, not nostalgia, misinformation, and benefits to the few at the expense of the majority.
Thank you, Ali. I think we have a consensus that really energy transition requires all of the board and really all hands together. Also, we need fundamental institutional change. And I think, Mika, a great reminder that regional cooperation is what we need urgently right now. So please give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.